Professor Monica Ketchum teaches history and sociology at Arizona Western College and Northern Arizona University, respectively. Those are both in Yuma, Arizona. And she also teaches history and women's studies at San Diego State Imperial Valley, which is, I think, a work setup that many of you at community college recognize. She completed a Fulbright GPA in Central Asia in 2018, which sparked an interest in forced labor in Uzbekistan, which is going to be part of what she's talking about. And she's also a member of several organizations dedicated to raising awareness about human trafficking, especially in the Central Valley where she is. So welcome, Professor Monica Ketchum. I guess you're farther southeast actually than the Central Valley. So Imperial Valley, my mistake. Welcome, Monica. Thank you.
Thank you. So my talk is entitled Enslavement, Coercion, or Exploitation, Understanding Labor Trafficking in the Modern Supply Chain. And while we were doing this institute this week, I've had to change a lot of things around because I was trying to make sure that I filled in a couple of gaps, but also I wanted to address, how do we actually teach this, or how do we spark an interest in students in terms of really understanding where our stuff comes from, and understanding the role that each of us plays in the coercive labor that is part of the supply chain. And incidentally, this picture that's in the background, it's a painting that I saw when I was in Uzbekistan, and I just snapped a picture with my cell phone, and then it's kind of come full circle because when I was there, I knew that they were growing cotton, and I was interested in the environmental impact of what's going on in Central Asia, the lake desiccation, of the RLC and irrigation wars and things like that. But then later, I learned a little bit more about the state forced labor, and so I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I tried to incorporate a couple of other case studies because I think that looking at certain case studies is a little bit easier than trying to tackle the overall issue when we're working with students. So let me advance this. Okay, for some reason I'm not.
There it is, right there.
All right, there we go. Everything's hidden. So the well-accepted formula for human trafficking is action plus means plus purpose. And while the action and purpose are important parts of the equation, someone is typically not considered a victim of human trafficking or modern slavery unless the means of force, fraud, or coercion can be proven. Of course, there's a caveat when it comes to minors and commercial sex. But in other words, what we see is there's this kind of narrow definition, and agency is really important. So this really makes it difficult when we're trying to identify adults who are being trafficked, because there's a lot of gray areas. And I would argue that these gray areas really prevent us from accepting the magnitude of the problem. The bottom line is that most people prefer seeing the world in black and white rather than exploring the nuances. And when it comes to labor trafficking, there's so many nuances, and there's so many different ways that people can be exploited in various degrees that it becomes really complicated. And so when we look at labor trafficking according to the ILO, it can include any number of exploitative labor practices. So it could include state-imposed forced labor. It could include indentured servitude or debt peonage, which are things that we've explored this week, private forced labor, and it may also include sexual exploitation. So there's a lot of different categories that this falls into. And incidentally, when I first became involved in raising awareness about human trafficking, my focus was on sex trafficking, and I really believed it was more prevalent than labor trafficking. The bottom line is it's easier to raise awareness about the sexual exploitation of minors. And while I don't disagree that this is important, a lot of activists will have you believe that the majority of trafficking is kidnapping young girls and forcing them into sex work. And if you followed the QAnon in recent years, it's really, you know, built around this idea that was brought up in the last talk about a cabal that is, you know, behind child sex trafficking, right? So, so that's kind of the narrative, and it's very easy to hook people and play upon their sympathies when you're talking about, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, right? But when you're talking about children, because we all have that soft spot in our heart for the exploitation and abuse of children, right? We don't want to accept that. But when we're looking at labor trafficking, it's much broader. Now, when we look at the issue of coercion and force and fraud and things like that, when it comes to sex trafficking, then that's not necessarily the case when it comes to children. If a minor is trafficked into commercial sex or exploited for commercial sex, that's cut and dry that they've been trafficked, right, for the most part. But it's a little bit more complicated when it comes to labor that doesn't include sexual exploitation. So when we look at this definition, back to the definition of labor trafficking from the ILO, based on this definition, labor trafficking really expands to encompass persons who may be literally enslaved to those who may have some degree of agency. In other words, they enter into a contract, but there may be fraud involved, there may be coercion involved. So that's where you get a lot of the gray areas. So like earlier forms of slavery, power really lies at the root of these labor practices, including slavery. However, whoops, I don't know what happened here. Yeah, however, rather than being comprised of individual enslavers, as in the past, most people exploited for their labor are really working for corporations, governments, and criminal organizations. This is really problematic because it's increasingly harder for us to put a face on the enslaver. Globalization and the changing economy has continued to place profits over people as companies and organizations and nations compete for market share. And with increased globalization, particularly since the 1990s, you have multinational corporations and global supply chains that really facilitate labor exploitation. The ability to slap a made in the USA label on something that is manufactured from components that might be made in many other countries with different labor practices, different wage structures, et cetera, really obscures the means through which products are produced, right? So there's organizations out there that are trying to bring transparency to the supply chain, but it's very muddled. We have shell corporations and we have, you know, offshore organizations and things like that. So so it gets really confusing when you do try to trace back where your things come from. And if you have a company that you say, well, this is a European company or an American company, you may accept that these are, and things might be expensive. You may accept that things are being produced with fair labor and fair labor practices, but in fact, I mean, with the way that supply chains and multinational corporations operate, you know, you can have a label on there that doesn't necessarily tell you where all of the components are from. And so that becomes really pretty confusing. So, so how do we help students or other people that are new to this really understand labor trafficking? So one way to introduce people to the concept of slavery in the supply chain is to have them take the quiz on slaveryfootprint.org. And a couple of days ago, Laura Murphy pointed out that this is pretty problematic. And one of the reasons that it's problematic is because the reality is that it's assigning you, based on the survey, a number of enslaved people that are working for you to support your lifestyle. And it can be a rude awakening, right? I'll disclose my number here. The other thing that's problematic is that it's still using the term slave instead of enslaved person. So you have like, and when you take the quiz, it says how many slaves are working for you. So anyway, when we do the slavery footprint, it's kind of like Oprah, right? Like, you're an enslaver and you're an enslaver and you have, 36 or 54 or whatever. And it can be helpful because it does help students understand, and the general public understand, that their lifestyle is supporting enslavement, right? But we're not individual enslavers, right? Things have really changed, and again, but is it more helpful than just trotting out the statistics that we hear all the time, such as 21 or 26 or whatever many million people are enslaved worldwide? Sometimes when you have these large statistics, it's hard to, there's the shock value and then it wears off because it's like too overwhelming. And so it does help to kind of personalize it. And then also it can be used to start a conversation about where our stuff comes from and who is involved in producing it, and their connection to forced labor. And it can also be used as a springboard to talk about consumerism, about capitalism, about individual as well as corporate responsibility in terms of consuming goods. So I think that there is some value to that. And like I said, it's, with mine, I ended up with, having 36 enslaved people supporting my lifestyle. And that's based on, I put in one car, a 2-bedroom house, and not a lot of, I don't have a lot of clothes, but but the more you have, the more you consume, the more you're contributing to this. So supply chains can be really overwhelming, but using case studies can serve to illuminate the magnitude of the problem. So we're going to look at a couple of products that I think every student owns and illustrate how it relates to forced labor. And then I'll talk briefly about a more something in California that happened that also shows how labor trafficking can happen right under our noses in our own backyards. So when we look at the mining of industrial minerals, one thing that stands out is that child labor, you can see here, the blue child labor is used in virtually all of the mines. And looking at cobalt in particular, which for those of you who don't know, it's used in components for batteries that power just about everything from, even though we may think, hey, I've got a Prius. Well, that battery probably has some cobalt in it that was produced by children. But smartphones are something that we all have. And so the numbers, this is according to the US Department of Labor, that over 50% of the world's cobalt comes from Democratic Republic of the Congo. And most current estimates is it's closer to about 50%, I mean 58%. And about 20% of that comes from artisanal mines. So you have the industrial mines where you have adults working, you have heavy machinery, et cetera. So you don't find that you have low wages and issues like that, but you don't find the same type of labor practices there. But about 20% of the cobalt in the Congo comes from these artisanal mines, which are smaller mines. Sometimes they're even under people's homes, and people will go down, climb down through a ladder underground, and they're bringing up the ore with the cobalt for processing. And this is where you have this problem of child labor. And this is not to say that adults are not exploited either. People are paid very low wages. In fact, the average wage for somebody working in these cobalt mines is $1 to $2 a day, and that includes children. So if you look at this supply chain, you can see that many familiar companies that we buy smartphones or automobiles from use cobalt, and if they can be traced back through the supply chain to CDM Huayo Cobalt, which is one of the largest cobalt refiners in the world, and the majority of their product comes from Congo. So what does this mean? It means that when we pay $700 or more for an iPhone, we're supporting these unfair labor practices, and in some cases, many cases, child labor, right? So that's kind of looking at it from the big picture. Why are these people being exploited? Why is child labor not, being overlooked? Part of it has to do with corruption. There's structural issues, but when you're looking at places like the DRC, you have school fees that are anywhere from $10 to $30 a month for children to go to school. And so if children are to get an education, a lot of times they have to earn their school fees themselves by working in the cobalt mines, right? So it's really this endless cycle of you want your children to get an education so that they don't have to do this, but the only way that you can afford to do that is for them to help working in the mines. Also, having children work, they're contributing to the family income, and so this continues to happen. And this is this is one of the images that we see when it comes to children working in the cobalt mines. A lot of them are also working in they have rivers where they're mining. They're also being exposed not only to the dust, which can cause lung disease, but people are being exposed to the contact on their skin, which causes dermatitis and other things. So it's not just the labor, but it's also this health issue. So that's smartphones. If we go to fast fashion or slow fashion, whichever you want to look at, we have the cotton supply chain. And so similar to the cobalt supply chain, it is really difficult to determine the source of the fibers, right? So with the cobalt, you may be able to trace it back to the refinery, but they're taking, product that's produced by child labor with product that's produced from industrial mines and putting it together. So you don't know, if I look at my phone, I don't know if my phone, was produced by child labor or not, or what percentage, right? So it gets really complicated. If you're looking at the cotton supply chain, it's similar because you have often production stages that occur across multiple countries. You have large ginners that are processing the cotton, that are buying they're sourcing their cotton from different countries, from different regions, and putting it all together. The coerced labor can happen in multiple stages. So it could happen in the fields, it could happen in factories and mills, and it could happen in sweatshops, right? I mean, so we can take that all over the world, including the United States, right? We have garment shops that exploit workers right here in California. And then, when it comes to retail or sales, you could have people that are being exploited in terms of providing the fashion. And with the case of Uzbekistan, what I think it was particularly fascinating about Uzbekistan in particular is the fact that you have this corruption of a traditional value that was used to coerce people and force people into working in the cotton fields. So there's this traditional Uzbek value called kashar, which basically is a voluntary mutual assistance. So serving the community, helping your neighbors, contributing to the greater good. And so this seems like such a great value, and it is a great value. It's something that many of us aspire to do. We want to support our communities. But the post-Soviet interpretation under the first president, Islam Karimov, was really changing that from simply something that you do for the good of the community to this patriotic duty, and it was conflated with nationalism and supporting the newly independent Uzbekistan. And so this includes what became state-imposed required labor. And what would happen is, specifically during the cotton harvest, I mean, they would have people also perform street cleaning and things like that, as a way to show that you were part of the community. But the biggest thing that happened was really to support the cotton harvest. So in the case of public sector employees and the economically disadvantaged citizens, they were basically forced to drop what they were doing during the harvest season and go pick cotton. And this was so that the national cotton quota could be met. This resulted in closing down schools for months at a time, teachers becoming foremen, and students in the fields picking cotton in order to make these goals. Wealthier citizens were also expected to lend financial support. So you could buy your way out. And this kind of reminds me of, people that would hire substitutes, if they were drafted, right? But you could buy your way out by buying fuel, providing transportation. So the business people, wealthier individuals would still be held to the standard. They needed to perform the kashar every year, but it was different, right? They didn't have to perform physical labor. And so beginning about 10 years ago, what you saw happening was a lot of pressure on the country. So NGOs started calling for sanctions against Uzbekistan, and different countries were boycotting Uzbek cotton. But again, with the supply chain, if you're buying clothes that were made in Bangladesh, for example, how could you be sure that the cotton wasn't coming from Uzbekistan, right? So understanding the sourcing and the lack of transparency was problematic. First President Islam Karimov really ignored the international pressures, but what we've seen in recent years is that President Mirziyoyev has taken some action, and especially over the last couple of years. So the ILO has said that child labor has been eradicated as of 2021, looking at the 2020 harvest, and that schools are no longer being closed for the cotton harvest. However, there are other reports that people are still, that children are still working, and they have started to eliminate the forced labor, but there's still about 4% of the 2 million people who are working in the cotton harvest are forced, and there's other reports that more people have also been coerced. So sometimes they have to sign a contract saying that I volunteer to do this. They are being, many of them are being paid better wages, and they are being paid, but it's something that takes them away from what they normally would do in order to support the country. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done, but Uzbekistan is an example of how NGOs and international pressure can affect positive change and really, change things from having 20% just 5, 6, 7 years ago, 15 to 20% of the population being forced into labor to now it's about 4%. So there has been some positive change there. So any questions before I move on?
Not for me.
Okay. So
Monica,
wait,
this
someone.
is Charlotte. I'm sorry. Since you asked, I missed that last number that you mentioned about 20% dropping to 4%. If you could please repeat that.
Yeah, so there's about 2 million people that were working, who have been consistently working during the harvest season to pick cotton. And so over the last 2 years, it has dropped to about 4% of that 2 million is forced. It used to be closer to 20%. And about, I think it was 2014, I think it was at 14%. So it has been steadily dropping, and just, the Karimov was the president. He was the first president, and he died in 2016. And so a lot of the change has happened since 2016. I mean, it wasn't overnight, but you do see the current president actually I guess caving to international pressure, but really trying to implement reforms. And so I think that's a step in the right direction, although there still are problems. And now looking at Uzbekistan and looking at Congo, I mean, you have this dynamic of child labor. In Uzbekistan, it was both adults and children who were forced to work. So there's a little bit of a difference there. The next thing I just want to talk really quickly about is kind of this trap that we fall into, that is the child trafficking trap. And that is really, and again, I don't mean to sound callous or anything, because it is very important, but a lot of times the focus is on the 25% of forced labor and sexual exploitation is of children, of minors. And so this is a way that we can get the general public to kind of get them to think about trafficking, but it doesn't matter if you say 25% or 100%. When the face of human trafficking is always presented as children, then that can be problematic, because we're ignoring the other 75%. And I thought I had advanced this, but so this is just a picture that might be Instagram friendly. And it is important to raise awareness about this. I'm not, saying that it isn't, but when we look at the majority, this is what the face of exploitative labor looks like. You have the majority of people working in the cotton fields in Uzbekistan are adults. The majority of the people that are working in the artisanal mines in the Congo are women. So I think about 70% of the workers are women. And then we have a local case, which I'll talk about now. So as Shane mentioned, I'm from the Imperial Valley, and just list all these vulnerable populations here. A lot of times when we're looking at human trafficking, we consider vulnerable populations. In the Imperial Valley, we're located on the California's eastern border with Mexico, positioning it as a major corridor for human trafficking. And as a rural county with a significant agricultural economy, unemployment is significantly higher than the rest of the state. According to the most recent unemployment statistics, this is pre-pandemic, the unemployment rate was 16.4%, while the state unemployment rate was 4.2%. So those were 2019 statistics. And the overall poverty rate in the county is 23.75%. And according to the most recent census data, educational attainment levels in Imperial County are low, with 55% of the population having no more than a high school diploma and less than 20% holding a college degree of an associate's degree or higher. And according to the same data, 30% of the population does not speak English, and up to 13% of the population may be undocumented. So the proximity to the Mexican border and the local population demographics really contribute to the possibility of exploitative labor practices and participation in the informal economy. And so when we look at the vulnerable populations in the Imperial Valley, I mean, we have a huge unemployment issue, but demographically, there are groups that might be more susceptible to labor trafficking or sex trafficking. Now, while we can all agree that we need to focus on children and girls and foster youth, right? The highlighted populations are sometimes those that fall through the cracks because they're less likely to pull on the heartstrings of local authorities in terms of being victims of exploitation. In fact, a lot of times they're looked at as nuisances, people who are causing problems rather than being subjected to exploitation or being trafficked. Undocumented immigrants in particular, sometimes people say, well, if somebody, came here without papers, then perhaps, if they're breaking the law, then they don't deserve our action or protection. But these are some of the people that we have found were susceptible to trafficking in the Imperial Valley. So the case study I just want to talk about really quickly is the case of IV Ministries. In 2019, the FBI raided Imperial Valley Ministries in El Centro, just a scant 5 blocks from my house, charging the organization's leaders with labor trafficking. And IV Ministries operated a faith-based recovery center and shelter, with their primary outreach being to persons who were recovering from drug or alcohol addiction. They would recruit people on the streets and sometimes through other agencies under the guise of providing recovery treatment. And when people entered their program, which included they have a shelter, they had to agree to abide by 29 rules. Now, among many of the rules were very similar to what you would find in any recovery home or sober living facility. They couldn't bring drugs or alcohol or consume drugs or alcohol. There were, there were curfews and things like that they had to abide by. But some of the things that they found were that among these 29 rules were that the people had to surrender their IDs, They had to surrender any money they had. They were not allowed to carry more than a couple of dollars on their person at any time. They also had to surrender their benefits, and this was to pay for the program, pay for the treatment. And so they would help them fill out their Social Security paperwork or their unemployment paperwork, things like that. And then the all of those monies would be paid to IV Ministries. They also limited their contact with outside people, so friends, family. And so this is a way that they would isolate them. So, and in many cases with this population, maybe the family didn't want to have anything to do with them, which is why they were at IV Ministries to begin with. They also restricted their movements outside of the home. And so what they get them on is the forced labor that was happening was peddling and collecting donations for the ministries. So what the people in the program would do was they would go and sell snacks like chips and candy. And if you look at some of the resources I had, if you look at chocolate and palm oil connection and things like that, so you also have kind of full circle. But they basically were collecting money to support the ministry. And people would see them at intersections. They'd see them in front of Rite Aid or Vons, any of the stores. So, so they were literally being trafficked in plain view. And despite the fact that they may have been viewed as a nuisance in the past, the public thought that the ministries were like saving these former drug users and helping them through their recovery. And so people, I think, really it didn't click, right? We kind of saw them as being industrious. They're out there trying to sell, you know, the giant pixie sticks or whatever, and giving out little flyers, asking for donations and things like that. But this case really illustrated how trafficking can happen in the US right under our noses, and it really brings that issue home. And so when we kind of share these types of case studies with people in our community, people in our classrooms, it can make them think in terms that, you know, trafficking is not something that happens somewhere else. Coerced labor is not something that happens somewhere else, but it can happen right in our own backyard. And I mean, this is not the only instance of trafficking that happens in the Imperial Valley. Obviously, there's this is the IV Ministries, and from the news, you had the leaders of the IV Ministries were charged. There's 12 of them that were charged with that, and and they identified 31 known victims, but I believe that they've come up with many more, because you also have this going back to people that had exited the program as well. And so we do have, you know, we do have other issues in the Imperial Valley. We have, you know, people that are working in the underground economy. We have people that are working in agriculture that are you know, not being paid fair wages and things like that. We've had accounts of we had in 2017, a shepherd came to Catholic Charities and said that they hadn't been paid in 6 weeks. And I did some research into that about how people are recruited to work on the H-2A visas, and this happens with shepherds in particular, and you know, they're often paid very, very poorly. So there's a lot of different ways that we can look at it. But I think that that picking one case, preferably something that's a little bit local, that is a way to kind of shine a light on the problem within the within our own communities. So I did provide some teaching resources. So there is a different presentation that's just an overview of understanding labor trafficking, and then like a participant packet. So as you're going through it, there's questions to answer, including some case studies, so that people, students can look for kind of red flags and what types of populations are typically targeted. So that, and these are all cases that are in the United States. So again, they're in different industries, but it's a way to, I think, open up people's eyes into the problems that we have in, you know, the global supply chain, but also some of the more local problems that we have with labor trafficking. I also included some links to some articles related to cotton, to palm oil, to cobalt, and then some of the organizations that are doing work, because I think something that is a great exercise to have with students is to have them look at a problem and then research what's being done to address it. What are some possible solutions? Can it be solved? Is it a problem without a solution? And get them to think about how they might take action to if not stop the problem, at least raise more awareness and address the problem in different ways. So I'm going to stop sharing. But I think that some of the takeaways, though, when we're looking at teaching this is really how we as consumers participate in the system. We talk about being a responsible consumer, you know, but in my classrooms, I mean, I live in this area where there's very high unemployment, where poverty is very high. And so how can you tell your students don't buy a $5 t-shirt at, you know, XYZ, right? Because you're supporting unfair labor practices. You know, they can't afford to buy, you know, these single sourced organic clothes that are made by, you know, the person who grew the cotton. So we can talk about fair trade. We can talk about, you know, these, you know, how we can make a difference, but is it really practical for our students? And so, so that's like one of the problems that that I think we face is that I don't know how can you address a problem, as Shane had mentioned at the beginning. How can you address a problem when you are you may have family members that are being oppressed or that are being exploited in those same industries, right? If you boycott it, are you taking away your family's income? And I think looking at why does this happen is really important. What are the structural issues? And you can look at a case study within any of the supply chains and kind of go back to the source, because a lot of times it happens in the source. Raw materials are cheaper. You know, the more manufacturing or processing that goes into something, the more expensive it gets. And so if you go back to the source and look at palm oil or look at chocolate or look at cotton, you know, what are those issues? And then you can also look at, you can connect this in addition to the human factor. You can also connect it to the environmental factors and look at responsible farming or mining practices and things like that. So there's different ways that you can approach it to integrate it into your current teaching practices. But I guess that's all I have to say as far as unless you have questions for me.
Well, let's say thank you. I want to say first, thank you.